Imagine a country where the macroeconomy is humming along with steady growth and, childhood mortality has just plummeted by this astonishing 50% in the recent decades.
Right, which sounds incredible on
It
paper.
sounds like a total success story, but then you flip the page and you see that 9 out of 10 working women are living on this terrifying knife edge of economic ruin. And literally 100% of the population is breathing toxic substandard air
Yeah.
every single day.
Yeah. 100%. It's a really jarring reality check.
He totally is. So welcome to you, our resident learner, to today's deep dive. We are getting into a really fascinating, highly restricted 15-page macroeconomic dossier on Cameroon.
And it is dense. I mean, incredibly dense.
Oh, yeah. The title alone is a mouthful. It's the Cameroon Socioeconomic and Human Development Structural Assessment Report from 1990 to 2023. And our mission for this conversation is to basically decode the structural bones of a nation that is caught in this profound developmental paradox.
It really is a paradox, yeah, because it completely defies the traditional linear models of economic progress that we're usually taught in school.
Right, like GDP goes up, so everyone gets richer.
Exactly. We are so conditioned to believe that top-line GDP growth just automatically trickles down into institutional stability and, human flourishing. But this assessment, it just shatters that assumption entirely.
It fully shatters it.
It forces us to look at the massive friction between raw economic expansion and actual human capital accumulation.
And before we even touch the data itself, I really have to talk about the visual rhetoric of this source material because it sets the exact tone for that friction.
Oh, the design choices are fascinating.
Right. Like this isn't your standard corporate consulting deck with, flashy infographics and big optimistic green arrows everywhere. The design constraints here are brutalist.
Brutalist is the perfect word for it.
It demands an absolute minimalist academic style. We're talking stark white backgrounds, muted Morandi colors. So like desaturated gray blues, pale gray greens.
Yeah.
And there is an explicit zero tolerance ban on 3D graphics or bright colors.
Yeah, which is so rare to see in corporate or macroeconomic reports today. It's basically the visual equivalent of a highly sobering medical diagnostic.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. A medical diagnostic.
Right, because when you are dealing with the structural vulnerabilities of an entire nation, macroeconomic fragility, population pressures, systemic governance deficits, flashy data visualization is actually, well, it's a form of deception.
Huh. Because it distracts you.
Exactly. It obscures the underlying pathology. By stripping away the color and the visual noise, the authors are forcing you to confront the raw architecture of the data.
Yeah, there's nowhere to hide.
Exactly. Like that wireframe map of Cameroon on the opening page.
Yeah.
It utilizes just 4 simple tags: economy, population, education, health. And that is a declaration of intent. It tells the reader, right from slide 1, that we are analyzing an interconnected ecosystem, not just, a series of isolated metrics.
Right. It's an ecosystem where you cannot adjust one variable without triggering this whole cascade of unintended consequences in the others.
Absolutely.
And the executive summary on slide 2, it immediately drops us into a 4-quadrant grid that maps this out so beautifully.
Using those great little monochromatic gray icons.
Yes. So you have this crushing demographic pressure from a massive youth dependency ratio in one quadrant. Then you have an economy that is structurally addicted to low-value services while totally abandoning industrialization.
Servicification, yeah.
Right. Then there's this terrifying health paradox where infectious diseases are conquered, but environmental toxins are ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And suffocating all of this, in the final quadrant, you have a governance bottleneck that is chronically starving the country of institutional trust.
And that interconnectedness, that is the master key to this entire deep dive.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. Why is the interconnectedness so crucial for the listener to grasp right now?
Because if you are an analyst trying to forecast emerging markets or maybe a policymaker studying developmental economics, you simply cannot look at educational leakage without understanding the macroeconomic labor market.
Right.
And you cannot understand the labor market without looking at foreign direct investment, which, as we'll see, is entirely predicated on governance. They're all gears in the same malfunctioning engine.
So let's start with the heaviest gear in that engine then, the demographic reality.
Let's do it.
When we look at the historical timeline provided in the data on slide 3, there's this area chart tracking the youth dependency ratio. And for those who might not use that term daily, That means the proportion of the population under 15 compared to working age adults.
The ratio of kids to adults, basically.
Exactly. And this ratio has historically hovered in this staggering band. They actually use a black dashed circle to highlight it of up to 91%.
Which is astronomical.
It really is. Now, the traditional narratives pushed by global business media is that a youth bulge is a country's greatest asset. We constantly hear about the aging populations of Europe and Japan, right? And how Africa is the future engine of global growth because of its youth.
Yeah, it's the standard talking point.
Right. But looking at this 91% dependency ratio, that narrative feels incredibly naive.
It is naive because it confuses demographic potential with structural inevitability.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
Well, a youth bulge is a massive reservoir of potential kinetic energy, but without the economic infrastructure to channel it, that energy becomes highly destructive.
Destructive how?
Well, when your dependency ratio creeps up toward 91%, it means that for almost every single working age adult, there is a dependent child requiring food, shelter, pediatric health care, and education.
Wow, 1-to-1.
Almost 1-to-1. That is an immense, immediate tax on current capital formation. It drains resources that could be used for industrial investment and diverts them entirely into just basic biological and social maintenance.
But wait, I want to challenge that framing for a second.
Sure.
Look at the tech ecosystems exploding in places like Lagos or Nairobi. We've seen how massive, highly connected youth populations can just bypass traditional state infrastructure entirely.
Right, the whole leapfrogging narrative.
Yeah. They utilize mobile penetration, digital payments, the informal economy, and they create these incredibly dynamic, unregulated innovation hubs. So doesn't an informal young service sector sometimes breed a rapid kind of economic resilience that Western highly regulated models just fail to account for?
That is a very popular counter-argument. And to be fair, those digital innovation hubs are absolutely real and they are impressive.
Right.
But we have to look at the scale of the denominator here. A booming tech hub might employ tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of highly skilled self-taught coders and entrepreneurs. But we are talking about a demographic wave of millions of young people.
Millions.
Yes. You cannot absorb a generation of that magnitude into freelance app development or digital marketing. It's just mathematically impossible. The only historical mechanism capable of absorbing low-skilled youth at that scale and moving them firmly into the middle class is mass manufacturing and industrialization. Period.
The Asian tiger model.
Precisely. Look at South Korea, Taiwan, or Singapore in the mid to late 20th century. They had the exact same demographic profile, a massive youth bulge.
Right, lots of kids.
Exactly. But they utilized targeted state policy to build factories, shipyards, electronics assembly lines. They captured that demographic dividend by creating millions of formal wage-paying jobs that required only basic literacy to start, but offered upskilling over time.
So they built a sponge to soak up all that labor.
Exactly. An industrial sponge. If a country fails to build that sponge, the demographic dividend sours. It ferments into massive youth unemployment, disenfranchisement, and eventually severe political instability.
Which makes the data on economic structure so incredibly alarming. Let's move to slides 4 and 5.
Yeah, this is where the mismatch becomes glaring.
Because if this massive generation of Cameroonian youth is stepping up to the plate expecting to enter a booming economy, the structural reality they are inheriting is completely misaligned with their needs.
Completely misaligned. What's fascinating here is how clearly the data shows this disconnect.
Right. When you look at the delta between the top-line macroeconomic growth and the actual per capita wealth accumulation, the discrepancy is brutal. We see gross national income GNI per capita fluctuating wildly. The chart marks these severe prolonged bottlenecks with gray shaded areas and downward arrows.
The economy is expanding on paper, but household wealth is essentially flatlining.
Exactly. Why is that happening?
And this is the illusion of extractive growth. You can have a GDP that is growing at a highly respectable 4 or 5% annually. Maybe it's driven by spikes in global commodity prices or massive state-backed infrastructure projects funded by foreign debt.
Okay, so the pie is getting bigger.
The pie is getting bigger. But if your population is growing at 2.5 or 3% concurrently,
Oh, right.
and the wealth generation is highly concentrated in capital-intensive sectors rather than labor-intensive sectors, the actual slice of the pie that the average citizen takes home just stagnates. The structural velocity of the economy isn't fast enough to outpace demographic gravity.
That is such a vivid way to put it. Demographic gravity. And you can see exactly why the wealth isn't trickling down when you look at the composition of the GDP on slide 5.
The stacked bar chart.
Yes, the 100% stacked bar chart. We're looking at a classic case of premature deindustrialization. The data shows services dominating, taking up 45 to 51% of the GDP. Agriculture remains a stable base. But industry.
Industry is the missing piece.
It's totally missing. The industrial sector, which, as you just pointed out, is the only proven mechanism for mass labor absorption, is fluctuating wildly, dropping down to a microscopic 2% of the economy at times.
2%. I mean, a 2% industrial base in a developing nation with a massive youth demographic is a 4-alarm fire for developmental economists.
Oh, 4-alarm fire.
Absolutely. It represents a completely broken conveyor belt to the middle class.
Because 51% services in this context does not mean what it means in London or New York.
No, not at all.
Right. In an advanced economy, a high service sector implies post-industrialization. You built the steel mills, you accumulated generational wealth, and your workforce transitioned into high-value knowledge work,
Right.
finance, consulting, software engineering.
Exactly.
But jumping straight from subsistence agriculture to a 51% service economy without passing through the manufacturing foes, that implies an entirely different, much darker kind of service sector, doesn't it?
It implies extreme systemic informality. In an environment with 2% industry, that 51% service sector isn't composed of investment bankers and data analysts.
Who is it then?
It is composed of people selling phone credit on the side of a highway. It's unregulated domestic work. It's micro-retailers in open-air markets, and millions of young men driving motorcycle taxis.
Oh.
These are survival mechanisms masquerading as a service economy. They are incredibly vulnerable to microeconomic shocks. They offer absolutely zero social protections or health care. And most critically, they suffer from stagnant productivity growth.
What do you mean by stagnant productivity growth?
Well, a motorcycle taxi driver cannot incrementally increase his productivity year over year the way a factory worker on an optimized assembly line can. He can only drive so many hours a day. The economic ceiling is incredibly low.
So the economy is essentially hollowed out. You have raw materials being pulled out of the ground at the bottom and a sprawling, informal survival economy at the top, and there's absolutely no industrial middle to connect the two.
That is the exact structural void we're talking about.
And that structural void leaves the country incredibly naked to global market forces. Which takes us to slide 6, global integration. Looking at the smooth line chart on trade openness, the volatility is staggering.
It really is whipsawing.
Yeah, the exports of goods and services are violently bouncing between 15% and 33% of GDP. They use these hollow circles and vertical lead lines to highlight the peaks and valleys. And to me, that isn't the signature of a diversified, agile economy. That screams primary product trap.
Oh, absolutely.
It looks exactly like an economy that is just ripping raw timber or unrefined cocoa out of the dirt and shipping it off completely at the mercy of global commodity price swings.
You've hit the nail on the head. The primary product trap is one of the most vicious cycles in developmental economics.
Explain how it works.
Well, when your export profile is dominated by unrefined goods, whether that's crude oil, raw timber, or raw agricultural yields, you have absolutely zero pricing power. You are a price taker, not a price maker.
Okay, think of it like a freelance software developer who only has one massive corporate client.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If that tech giant is having a good quarter, the freelancer is flush with cash. But the second that corporation's stock dips and they freeze contractor budgets, the freelancer faces immediate, catastrophic ruin. They have no diversification, no premium product offering that makes them indispensable.
Exactly. They just absorb the shock.
And Cameroon's export engine is similarly exposed. If the global price of timber drops 20% because of a supply glut in South America, Cameroon's national revenue plummets instantly.
Right, and because they aren't moving up the value chain, they aren't turning that raw timber into premium furniture or that crude oil into refined petrochemicals, they capture none of the high-margin profits. They just absorb all the volatility.
It's all risk and no reward.
Exactly. And when global markets sneeze, an economy lacking an industrial base catches a severe, debilitating cold. That wild fluctuation between 15% and 33% of GDP isn't because domestic productivity is swinging wildly. It's because the global price tags on their natural resources are being rewritten in commodities markets in Chicago or London.
Man, and who ultimately bears the brunt of that macroeconomic volatility? That brings us to section 4, slide 7. And I have to say, Here is where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply sobering.
The employment data.
Yes, this is what I consider the most haunting data point in this entire assessment. They use this very minimalist waffle chart or horizontal progress bar for a metric called vulnerable employment,
Yeah.
specifically female vulnerable employment.
And the number is staggering.
The progress bar is filled with this dark gray to 92%. 9 out of 10 working women are trapped in vulnerable employment.
It is a systemic failure of profound proportions.
And when we talk about macroeconomic volatility and G&I bottlenecks, it can sound very abstract, right? Like just numbers on a page.
Yeah.
But this 92% figure is where the macro-level failures crush the micro-level reality.
Absolutely.
What does 92% vulnerable female employment actually mean for the mechanistic functioning of a society over, say, a multi-generational timeline?
Mechanistically, it means the complete destruction of household resilience.
How so?
Well, let's look at the definitions. The International Labor Organization defines vulnerable employment primarily as own account workers and contributing family workers.
Okay.
In practice, this means 92% of the female workforce operates entirely outside the boundaries of formal labor law. There is no maternity leave, there is no sick pay, there is no legal recourse for workplace exploitation or wage theft.
They're completely on their own.
Completely. If a woman working in the informal agricultural sector or a street market gets sick for a week, her household experiences an immediate severe caloric deficit.
Wow. A caloric deficit, meaning they literally don't eat.
They literally cannot afford enough food for that week.
And the sociology of this is devastating because we have decades of empirical data proving that income controlled by women is disproportionately reinvested back into the household.
Oh, yes. Consistently.
Right. It goes into childhood nutrition, preventative health care, and education. When 92% of your female economic engine is operating on the absolute margins of biological survival, household capital formation is practically mathematically impossible.
Precisely. You cannot build a robust, shock-resistant macroeconomic structure when the primary caretakers and a massive portion of the overall labor force are one bad harvest or one medical emergency away from destitution.
Right.
It basically guarantees that the next generation starts from a position of profound compounding disadvantage.
Which forces us to look at the state's apparatus for human capital formation. Slide 8. Because if the household is too economically fragile to build human capital, the burden falls entirely on the public education system.
The schools have to pick up the slack.
But when we look at the data on foundational education, we see the youth bulge from our first quadrant, violently colliding with the reality of state capacity. The scatter plot here shows a pupil-teacher ratio sitting at an astonishing 1 to 44, peaking up to 1 to 51.
Which is just, it's unmanageable.
To put that in perspective, the chart shows an international benchmark line for effective pedagogy at 1 to 30. And there's this massive double-headed arrow showing the huge gap between the reality of 51 and the benchmark.
When you hit a ratio of 51 students to a single teacher, you are no longer operating an education system, you are operating a crowd control facility.
A crowd control facility, that is bleak. And the data visualizes the fallout of this perfectly on slide 9, with a funnel chart illustrating massive leakage.
Right, the gray dots falling out of the funnel.
Yeah, these gray dots represent out-of-school and dropout rates, which fluctuate in direct correlation with population growth. The traditional metaphor here is trying to fill a leaky bucket, but looking at this, that feels far too passive.
What's a better way to look at it?
It's more like a miscalibrated supply chain algorithm. The raw material, meaning the youth demographic, is incredibly abundant. But the processing plants, the schools, are so severely bottlenecked and under-resourced that 60% of the inventory just spoils on the loading dock.
That is a much more accurate assessment, because the leakage isn't accidental, it is structurally guaranteed.
Structurally guaranteed.
Yes. When a teacher has 51 students, individualized cognitive development is a physical impossibility. The students who fall slightly behind are permanently left behind. Frustration mounts, and crucially, the opportunity cost of education shifts.
What do you mean by the opportunity cost shifting?
Think about the household we just talked about. For a household struggling with vulnerable employment, the perceived economic value of keeping a child in an overcrowded, failing classroom plummets. It becomes economically rational to pull that child out to assist with informal labor or agricultural work. The family needs hands more than they need a kid sitting in a room of 51 people learning very little.
So the cognitive capital of the nation is just bleeding out into the informal sector, perpetuating the exact same cycle of vulnerability we just discussed. It's a closed loop of human capital depreciation.
But cognitive capital is only one half of the equation.
Right. Health is the other half.
Exactly. A workforce cannot be productive, regardless of their education, if their physical baseline is fundamentally compromised.
Which brings us to Section 6, the health paradoxes. Slides 10, 11, and 12. And this is probably the most complex paradox in the entire dossier.
It's a real emotional roller coaster, this section.
It really is. The data on public health is deeply conflicting, and it forces us to confront the epidemiological transition of a developing nation. Let's start with the triumph, though, because it is monumental. Slide 10 uses a step-line chart to show under 5 child mortality dropping by over 50%.
A huge win.
Yeah, there's a bold downward arrow connecting the historical high of roughly 200 deaths per 1,000 live births down to the 130s.
We really have to pause and respect the sheer scale of human suffering that has been averted here. A 50% reduction in childhood mortality is the hallmark of highly effective, targeted public health interventions.
Vaccines, sanitation, all of that.
Exactly. We are looking at the successful deployment of basic sanitation, clean water access, and massive immunization campaigns targeting traditional infectious diseases like malaria, cholera, and measles.
It is an incredible victory. It proves that state capacity, when aligned with international aid and targeted logistics, can execute complex directives. But, and this is a massive, but human capital isn't just about surviving infancy so you can enter the labor market.
No, it's about what happens after you survive.
Right. It's about the lungs breathing the air on the factory floor or in the agricultural field for the next 50 years. And that's where this progress narrative hits a terrifying brick wall.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah, please do.
we see a terrifying trade-off. The very next data point on slide 11 shows a minimalist donut chart, and it is perfectly closed at 100%. 100% of the population is exposed to PM2.5 air pollution that exceeds World Health Organization's safety guidelines.
Every single citizen, from the poorest rural farmer to the wealthiest urban elite.
It is completely inescapable.
And for anyone listening who checks their phone's air quality app occasionally, think about this. Imagine if that app read hazardous every single day of your life, everywhere in your country. And PM2.5 isn't just unpleasant smog. These are microscopic particulates, smaller than 2.5 micrometers. They completely bypass the human body's evolutionary defenses.
Right, they go straight into the system.
Exactly. They penetrate deep into the alveolar region of the lungs and cross directly into the bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammation. Why is this happening universally across the country?
The sources of this are deeply tied to the structural economic failures we've already mapped out.
Okay, connect the dots for us.
Because there is a lack of advanced electrical infrastructure, massive swaths of the population still rely on the burning of raw biomass for daily cooking and heating.
Wood, charcoal, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Combine that with unregulated, highly polluting vehicle fleets in urban centers and the industrial dust from extractive mining and unregulated agriculture. It's a perfect storm.
And the ecological data on slide 12 compounds this perfectly. They use this axis-less dark gray area chart just to show the raw trend. And we see a steep, unyielding rise in CO2 emissions running parallel to severe net forest depletion.
It is the grim ecological price tag of a flawed development model.
The country is attempting to grow economically by literally consuming its own environmental foundation. They are cutting down the forest to export raw timber, which, by the way, ties right back to our primary product trap.
Yep, the single client problem.
Exactly. And that actively destroys the nation's natural carbon sinks and air filtration systems. Then they burn unregulated fossil fuels and biomass, pumping PM2.5 into the newly degraded atmosphere.
This creates a ticking time bomb for the macroeconomic future of the state. Let's extrapolate this out 20 years.
Okay, let's play it out.
You have this massive demographic wave of children who survived the acute infectious diseases of infancy thanks to vaccines, but they are spending their entire developmental window breathing highly toxic air. When this generation hits their peak earning years, their 30s, 40s, and 50s, they're going to experience an epidemic of chronic, non-communicable diseases.
Like asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer, severe cardiovascular degradation.
Exactly. And while you can treat malaria with a relatively cheap, acute course of medication, you cannot cheaply treat millions of cases of chronic COPD. The long-term financial burden of treating an entire population suffering from environmentally induced chronic illness will completely bankrupt a developing healthcare system.
Wow.
It is a terrifying developmental paradox. You successfully save the children from the diseases of the past, only to slowly poison them as adults through the environmental consequences of unregulated economic survival.
It essentially nullifies the demographic dividend before it even pays out. If your massive workforce is chronically ill and missing weeks of work due to respiratory failure, your industrial productivity just caps out.
It hits a hard ceiling.
Which forces the ultimate question of this entire deep dive. Why? Why is the wealth not diversifying? Why can't the state build enough schools to lower the 1-to-51 ratio? Why can't they regulate basic air quality? The data points us to the absolute root cause in Section 7, governance and the institutional bottleneck.
This is the bedrock upon which the entire socioeconomic structure rests, or in this case, crumbles.
And as we unpack this, I want to be explicitly clear. As analysts, we are maintaining absolute neutrality here. We are looking strictly at the worldwide governance indicators provided by the World Bank.
Right, the WGI data.
Yes, we're not litigating specific political actors or systems. We are simply examining how institutional metrics objectively dictate the flow of global capital and the formation of human development.
Which is how capital markets view it anyway.
Exactly. And the metrics here are grim. Slide 13 shows a horizontal bar chart. The rule of law percentile rank sits in the bottom 1% to 29th percentile globally. Control of corruption is equally depressed, hovering between the 14th and 24th percentile.
It's consistently in the bottom third globally.
Right. And visually, this is the only place in the entire 15-page dossier where the authors broke their strict Morandi color palette. They used a stark red circle to highlight these low governance scores.
That red circle is a visual siren. It is telling the reader, here is the cancer, everything else is just a symptom.
Walk us through the mechanics of that. Why does a low rule of law score immediately short-circuit everything we've talked about, from the 2% industrial base to the 92% vulnerable female employment?
Because capital, at its core, is inherently cowardly.
Cowardly, I like that.
It's true. It seeks predictable returns and legal safety. We established earlier that the only way to absorb the massive youth bulge and pull women out of informal survival work is through mass industrialization.
Right, the factories and assembly lines.
Exactly. But a country cannot industrialize on its own dime. It requires massive infusions of foreign direct investment, or FDI. A multinational corporation needs to build a billion-dollar manufacturing plant. But they will absolutely refuse to deploy that kind of capital in an environment where the rule of law is in the 20th percentile.
Because the risk premium is just too high.
Exactly. If you build a factory, you need to know that contracts with local suppliers will be enforced by an impartial judiciary. You need to know that your property rights won't be arbitrarily seized. You need to know that the control of corruption is strong enough that unpredictable, extortionate bribes won't completely destroy your operational margins.
Right. The math has to work.
And when the governance environment is high risk and unpredictable, as slide 14 shows with those stagnant spark lines for political stability, the smart capital flees.
Which leaves only the predatory capital.
Precisely. High-risk governance repels the complex, job-creating manufacturing investments, but it attracts extractive industries. Mining conglomerates and timber exporters are highly tolerant of poor governance because their operations are enclaved.
Enclaved, meaning they just wall themselves off.
Exactly. They bring in their own security, extract the raw material, and ship it out. They don't need a highly educated local workforce, and they don't care about local institutional health. This locks the country right back into the primary product trap we discussed in Section 3.
Oh, it's a perfect vicious circle.
Yes. And it ensures that the wealth generated is captured by a tiny, insulated elite rather than distributed through broad wage-paying jobs.
Which brings us to a classic, almost philosophical debate in developmental economics. Is governance the chicken or the egg? Can a developing nation utilize raw resource exports to simply buy its way into wealth and then use that wealth to eventually build strong, transparent institutions? Or must a country do the agonizingly hard work of building robust institutions first as a prerequisite for getting rich?
The empirical data, not just from this dossier, but from global economic history, overwhelmingly supports the latter. Institutions are the mandatory prerequisite for broad-based, sustainable wealth accumulation.
You have to build the rules first.
Yes. If you pump billions of dollars of oil or timber revenue into a system with a 15th percentile control of corruption, That wealth will not build schools to lower the 1-to-51 teacher ratio, and it will not build hospitals to treat PM 2.5 exposure. It will simply be captured and offshored.
Like trying to carry water in a sieve.
Exactly. You have to repair the structural integrity of the plumbing before you turn on the high-pressure water of economic growth. Otherwise, the pipes just burst and flood the basement.
Which perfectly sets up the grand synthesis of this assessment. Slide 15. The final conclusion is presented as a minimalist logic flowchart, and the design instruction literally mandates that 40% of the page must be left as empty white space to ensure academic rigor and restraint.
I love that detail. The silence on the page forces you to focus on the inescapable logic of the paradox.
It really does. The flowchart mapped the exact friction we've been discussing. You have the illusion of progress. GDP and the service sector are expanding. But that expansion hits the hard reality of human capital deficits, the vulnerable employment, and the failing schools.
And the flow of progress is completely blocked by the constraint of weak governance. The flowchart makes it explicit. Without foundational public governance construction, without the rule of law and anti-corruption frameworks, institutional dividends cannot be released.
Yeah, and the final mandate of the report is a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
It argues that national investment must pivot away from the superficial chasing of top-line economic expansion and focus entirely on deep human capital accumulation and institutional reform.
It's essentially demanding that they stop trying to build the penthouse when the foundation is sinking into the mud.
Right. Deep human capital accumulation means you stop just building empty school structures for political photo ops, and you actually invest heavily in training and paying teachers a living wage to fix that 1-to-51 ratio. It means you implement aggressive environmental regulations to curb PM 2.5 so that your future workforce isn't physically degraded before they even reach working age.
And foundational governance means prioritizing judicial independence and contract enforcement above all else, because that is the only signal that will attract the foreign direct investment necessary to build the factories that can absorb the youth bulge. Growth without structural integrity isn't development, it's just a bubble waiting to pop.
As you are listening to this, I want you to strip away the macroeconomic context for a moment and apply this flowchart to your own reality. Think about your own company, your organization, or even your personal life architecture.
Oh, it scales perfectly.
It totally does. How often do we obsess over economic expansion, chasing aggressive revenue targets, trying to scale rapidly, focusing purely on top-line growth while systematically starving our human capital and our governance? We ignore employee burnout, we underinvest in training, we let our internal culture and operating procedures rot, and then we are shocked when the whole enterprise collapses under its own weight.
Right. This dossier isn't just a critique of a single nation. It is a masterclass on the physics of complex systems.
A universal truth. The underlying architecture dictates the limits of your growth. But as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought that builds on everything we've just unpacked. We have spent an hour dissecting this massive youth bulge as a severe systemic burden, a strain on schools, a threat of unemployment, a demographic time bomb.
It's been pretty heavy.
Yeah, but let's zoom out and look at the global macroeconomic chessboard in the year 2050.
Ah, the demographic inversion.
Exactly. By 2050, the populations of the global north, Europe, Japan, South Korea, parts of North America are going to be experiencing catastrophic demographic collapse. They're going to be top-heavy with retirees and utterly starved for young, energetic labor to maintain their economies.
The geopolitical leverage will completely flip.
Yes. If this massive generation of Cameroonian youth and the broader youth demographic across the continent can survive this current structural bottleneck, if the nation can execute the agonizingly difficult institutional reforms, enforce the rule of law, and harness digital upskilling to bypass the broken physical classrooms, they are not a burden. They become the most indispensable, highly sought-after global workforce on the planet.
Hold all the cards.
Right. The demographic time bomb we see in the data today could, with the right structural alchemy, become the engine that keeps the entire global economy afloat in the second half of the 21st century.
It is the ultimate high-stakes gamble. The raw material for a global economic miracle is sitting right there, but it requires an absolute commitment to structural reality over political illusion.
It all depends on whether they're willing to look at this unvarnished, Morandi-colored diagnostic, stop applying Band-Aids to the top-line GDP, and finally do the grueling work of fixing the bones. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We respect your time, and we love that you choose to spend it with us. Looking past the surface narratives, challenging the conventional wisdom and exploring the hidden mechanics that run our world. Keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you next time.